Okay, hello, I'm Lois Oliver reading today, and the author that I'm reading is a woman named Ann Patchett. And she's obviously very popular because I tried to get this in hardcover at the library and I was 27th on the list. So this book, which is a set of essays and a kind of memoir. And so you learn a lot about her from these three. I'm only going to read three of these essays. But she has a pretty long history of writing, and she wrote for 7 years for 17 magazine, and then she quit in a huff. I don't know. There's a lot of fun stories about her. But in any event, and she lives in Nashville, and she owns with a friend a very big bookstore, independent bookstore, and it has they recently expanded and got a bookmobile so they can take their things around. So I'm going to read, as I said, 3 essays. And the first is called The First Thanksgiving. I was so homesick my freshman year of college that my cousins bought me a plane ticket to come home to Nashville for Halloween. Halloween? It was a fantastic extravagance, the unintended consequence of which was that I really couldn't come home 3 weeks later for Thanksgiving and then turn right back around and come home for Christmas. I would have to spend Thanksgiving at school. Though I had some budding college friendships, none of them were close enough that first semester to rate an invitation to someone's house for the holidays. I went to Sarah Lawrence, a half hour north of Manhattan. I lived in a nice dorm that had once been someone's house. The kitchen was still downstairs, and I could just sit tight and wait out the long weekend. Were I to put a pin in the mouth of my life and say, here, this is where adulthood began, I would stick it on that Thanksgiving weekend in 1981. I was 17 years old. While my roommate packed her bag to take the train home to Boston on Wednesday, I walked to the A&P in Bronxville with a shopping list. I had checked out a copy of The Joy of Cooking from the library when I realized I would have to stay. I made a list: butter, sugar, onions and celery, various potatoes, a turkey. There was money from babysitting and my weekly shift in the dean's office. I was a girl who always had some money in her pocket. I found 5 other kids who lived in other dorms who also had no way of getting home and invited them for dinner. When I went to the cafeteria for lunch, I put a lot of silverware in my purse. The house where I lived had plates and cups, a few basic pans, but very little silverware. It never occurred to me to ask someone if I could stay in my room. It was my room, after all. But on Wednesday night, when the radiators in the house were turned down to whatever temperature was needed to keep the water in the pipes from freezing, I wondered if maybe I'd been expected to vacate along with all the other girls in the dorm. Too late now. Buildings and Grounds was closed until Monday morning. In those happy dark days before cell phones and the internet, such miscalculations were solved not by changing the situation, but by changing yourself. I put on another sweater and my coat. I suppose before I went to college, I had been very modestly helpful to my mother on Thanksgiving. When she asked me to peel something, I peeled it, then went away to watch the Macy's parade on television until she called me back to peel something else. I showed no initiative and made no effort until 1981, when the Thanksgiving dinner that people were coming to was mine. That was when I started cutting frozen butter into pea-sized chunks with a frozen knife in my frozen hands to make a pie crust. Aspects of this story seem mildly shocking in retrospect. The haphazard aloneness of it all, the wrong-headed decision masquerading as moxie. But most stunning is the unquestioned belief that everything I cooked had to be made from scratch. I made yeast rolls, for heaven's sake. I cooked down fresh cranberries into sauce. I, who had never touched a raw turkey, washed out the cavity, patted it dry. I cooked the neck and giblets along with a little chicken broth, made a stock from which I would later make the gravy. Why would someone who didn't know how to cook think this was what Thanksgiving required? I didn't know any better. All those years, my mother had made a beautiful dinner. I hadn't been paying attention, and now that I needed her guidance, I had only enough quarters to call home from the payphone once. I wanted to call when the dinner was over. I wanted to tell her how well it had all turned out. What I had that day was self-reliance and a book, as I would later learn was all I really needed. When you look up dressing in The Joy of Cooking, you will not find a footnote that says, Pepperidge Farm is perfectly fine if you're tight on time. No, you'll get a recipe for dressing. And if you follow it step by step, you'll wind up with something delicious. On that freezing holiday weekend when my adult life began, I not only learned to cook, I learned to read. I didn't improvise. If the recipe said 2 teaspoons of chopped sage, that's what went in the pot. Beat the egg whites for 7 minutes. I looked at my watch and went to work. I did not glance at the instructions. I followed them, so that even now, when someone claims they don't know how to cook, I find myself snapping, "Do you know how to read?" Paying close attention to the text and realizing that books can save you, those were the lessons I learned in my freshman year of college when school was closed. I then went on to use this newfound understanding to great advantage for the rest of my life. Books were not just my education and my entertainment, they were my partners. They told me what I was capable of. They let me stare a long way down the path of various possibilities so that I could make decisions. And Thanksgiving dinner? It was okay. The baking sheets were cheap and I should have moved up the racks in the oven. I burned the rolls. The mashed potatoes were cold by the time we sat down, and the green beans were still crunchy little twigs. Or to put it another way, dinner was brilliant. The other kids brought wine, and we left the oven door open and the gas burners on and treated the stove as a fireplace. They thought I was amazing because I knew how to make a Thanksgiving dinner, and I thought I was amazing because I'd pulled it off. We were all such grown-ups that night, a bunch of strays mimicking the patterns we brought from home. We laughed and drank and stuffed ourselves in fulfillment of the tradition. I wish I could remember whether we had the sense to be grateful then for food, for the comfort of one another, for the luxury of our education. We are so insanely fortunate and much too cool to bow our heads to anything. But in our hearts, I hope we recognize the bounty that lay before us. The year after that, my friend Erica Buxbaum invited me to come home with her for Thanksgiving. Her parents then invited me for the next 2 Thanksgivings as well. And they invited me long after we graduated because I made excellent gravy and they never learned how. Erica and her mother were with me in the kitchen while I browned the flour in the roasting pan, but they never seemed to get it, and I never taught them because I loved them. I wanted to be invited back. So that's the first of the... What's my next one? The next one is called A Paper Ticket is Good for 1 Year. When I was 29 and living in Montana with my boyfriend, I took a year-long fellowship at Radcliffe College and moved by myself to Massachusetts at the end of the summer. At the time, I thought it was too great an opportunity to pass up, but by the middle of October, I could see what the decision was going to cost me. When I called our apartment in Missoula late at night, no one answered. And when I did manage to reach my boyfriend, he was distracted, evasive. Brokenheartedness was not yet upon me, but I could see it clearly up ahead, the bright lights of a car heading in my direction. I considered going back to Montana to stake my claim, but if the damage to our relationship was already done, and I suspected it was, then leaving Radcliffe just meant I would be out both a boyfriend and a fellowship. In Cambridge, the days grew shorter and colder. I trudged back to my tiny apartment from the library, past the Brattle Theater, past Sage's Market, past the American Express travel agency. Something about the travel agency stopped me. I looked at the posters hanging in the window, the Eiffel Tower, the white sand beaches of Tahiti. Maybe my assessment of the situation had been too limited. Maybe I didn't need to be in Montana or Cambridge. I put my hand on the door and went inside. I'm sorry travel agencies don't exist anymore, at least not as the plentiful dream shops they used to be. Those wide windows advertising the beauty of the world, the men and women behind the counter always there to help you go. When I went to Europe in college, it was Vienna that stuck with me. The cafes that lined the Ringstrasse, the catacombs beneath St. Stephen's Cathedral, the glorious Hofburg Palace. I always believed that someday I would go back. So I left the travel agency that night with a plane ticket in my coat pocket and a week's confirmed stay in a pension. I would go in December for my 30th birthday. The travel agent was impressed by my spontaneity, as was I. I didn't have a lot of money in those days, but I had enough for a single impetuous decision. Walking back to my apartment, I found I had a different view of myself entirely. I was independent, adventuresome. I wasn't sitting around waiting to see what someone decided about my future. I was the master of my fate. I was the captain of my soul. Vienna, my boyfriend said to me over the phone, by yourself? I pictured a distant future in which people sat around a table at a dinner party, reminiscing in turn about what they had done on their 30th birthdays. I would tell them I went to Vienna by myself. I got a booklet of traveler's checks and $200 in Austrian shillings. I got a new passport. At the end of November, I told my friends in Cambridge goodbye, and they wished me an early happy birthday. I packed my bag and put it by the door. My plan was to call for a taxi to take me to the airport at 5 o'clock. I sat down on the edge of my bed and waited. It was 4. Then it was 4:30. And then it was 5. I kept telling myself to pick up the phone and call the taxi. I told myself I could walk to Harvard Square and find one. It was 5:15. I had planned to get to the airport early. There was still plenty of time to make the flight. I sat and looked at the clock. It was 5:45. Was it bravery I lacked? Was I afraid of missing the boyfriend I'd be losing soon enough? Was I sick, scared? Was I having a premonition about a plane crash that I didn't understand? I had no idea. All I knew was that I wasn't standing up. I wasn't picking up my bag. I wasn't picking up the phone. It was as if something very heavy was sitting on my head, holding me in place. It was 6 o'clock. I lay back on my bed, still in my coat, and cried from the shame of it all. 4 hours later, I woke up with a fever and started vomiting. It went on like that for 5 days. I was never so sick or so relieved. Whatever it was that struck me down in my apartment would have struck me on the plane. And then what? I would be spectacularly sick at the airport in Vienna. I would have made it to the pension somehow, boiling with fever, infectious, and not speaking German. I called a friend who left ginger ale and soda crackers outside my door. I slept through my 30th birthday, and the day after that, my boyfriend called to check on me. I got better. After Christmas, he confessed that he'd fallen in love with one of his students. We had lived in a furnished apartment in Missoula and didn't own much. He emailed me He mailed me what was mine in a few large boxes. Everything hurt and nothing killed me. I took my paper ticket back to American Express. The prepaid room in the pension was a complete loss, but the travel agent told me I had 1 year to use the ticket to Vienna. The following autumn, I was living in Nashville. All year long, I heard the plane ticket ticking toward its expiration in my desk drawer. I still planned to go and go alone, but having failed at my departure once, I was having a harder time making a commitment. In the meantime, I had been on 3 dates with a nice man named Carl. His wife had left him, and he was very much adrift, having to rethink what he knew about his life. On our 4th date, I looked at him across the table in the restaurant. He wasn't a stranger. He worked with my mother, and yet he wasn't someone I actually knew. But what did life ever come to without a few risks? I asked him if he wanted to go to Vienna. Yes, he said yes. And then he said it again without giving it another thought. Yes. It reminded me of the night I walked into the travel agency. I told him that because of my ticket, we would have to go soon. He told me that soon was not a problem. Well, I hadn't meant this as a dating strategy, but it functioned as one, just the same. So I pass on along this advice. If you meet someone you like, and you have the means to do so, ask that person to go with you to Vienna. As it turned out, we were in Vienna for Carl's birthday, which was a couple of weeks before mine. We ate pastries filled with marzipan, walked along the Danube holding hands. In the catacombs, we struck up a conversation with a young woman wearing a backpack. She was traveling alone. She was, I think, from Alabama. When we walked away, Carl said she looked tired and broke and that we should invite her to dinner. So we went back and found her and brought her with us to a wonderful restaurant called Dry Hussars. We drank little glasses of freezing, syrupy vodka with peach pulp in it. I wondered if some benevolent stranger might have invited me to dinner had I made it to Vienna a year before. And then I remembered, no, I would never have been able to leave my room. Carl and I had made plans to spend half our trip in Prague, but on our way to the train station, he saw a very old set of silverware in a shop window. After some discussion with the proprietor, he bought the forks, spoons, and knives and had them shipped to Tennessee. The transaction took longer than expected, and because of this, we missed our train, the last train to Prague, until the next day. We stood in the vast station with our suitcases, looking up at the departures board. Budapest, he said, scanning our options. I've never been to Budapest. I allowed that I had never been to Budapest either, and so we took that train instead. It mattered less where we were going and more who we were with. In fact, that continues to be the case. Carl bought me a thin gold ring in Budapest to commemorate the day, and 11 years later, I married him. We had been in such a rush, and then we were in no rush at all, proving that we were impetuous and prudent in the extreme, proving that we were in love and that the trip was worth waiting for. So the last essay is in later years. I mean, you can see her marching along in her life. This one is called The Moment Nothing Changed. The days are shorter now. It stays dark longer. I tell myself this is why my husband and dog and I have slept until 6:30 this morning. We never sleep until 6:30. An entirely different set of neighborhood dogs are out when Sparky and I go for a walk. At 5:30, our usual time, it's just Chloe the German Shepherd and a handful of runners. Byron, the cardiologist who lives a few blocks away and works at the same hospital as my husband, Henry from across the street, our neighbor Bob. But at 6:30, Scout, the English setter, is out, Violet, the Havanese, Moose and Chaka, the chocolate labs, and Molly. I don't know what Molly is. All the runners have run home. It's a dog party. We discuss Isabella's new harness. Isabella is the prettiest little Cavalier King Charles Spaniel that has ever been put on this earth. She is the kind of dog I'd want to carry in my purse at Bergdorf's, were I the sort of person that went to Bergdorf's with a spaniel in my purse. When we come home, I fill the blender with spinach, a banana, an avocado, 2 dates, some lemon juice, water and ice, and my husband and I drink the results for breakfast. From time to time, I believe I have found the answer to life, and right now I think it's spinach. Sparky and I go to Parnassus. This is her bookstore. There are as many dogs in the bookstore as there are dogs on my street. Opie, a large hound, belongs to Andy, the store manager. Belle comes to work with Cat Bear, who is ancient and has to wear a belt with a Kotex in it because otherwise he pees on the books. Belongs to Cat Bear, that's Bear, who's wearing the belt, lives in is a fancy dappled dachshund, lives in a crossbody sling on Nicky's chest. The dogs mostly stay in the back where it's easier to beg for treats. The dog treats are kept in the staff bathroom, and whenever Sissy goes in the bathroom, the dogs stand outside the door in a pack and wait for her. She slides dog biscuits under the door, and we yell at her to stop because Opie is better at the game than the rest of them and gets all the biscuits. I'm at a big table in the back office signing copies of my new book for the store. I have 1,600 to sign, and I feel like I'm losing my mind. Mary Laura pulls up Old Spice commercials on her computer, and Kat and Nikki and I watch them over and again until we know the words and can act them out ourselves. Look at me, we say to one another. Now look at your man. The next morning, I'm up at the regular time. I wave to Chloe, the German Shepherd, to Sparky, who weighs about 15 pounds. My dog, Sparky, who weighs about 15 pounds, is intimidated by Chloe despite her friendliness. The runners run by. I have a meeting at the bookstore with people who are flying in to discuss a future bookstore project. I'm wearing a dress. It's early and the store isn't open yet. I gave these people my cell phone number so they could call me when they arrived and I could unlock the door for them. I turn my cell phone on about 10 times a year and only for occasions such as this. When it rings, it's Byron, the cardiologist. Byron, I say, I can't understand why he would be calling on my cell phone when I never carry it and no one has the number anyway. He says his name again and says, come over to the hospital, please, even though he's pretty certain my husband is not having a heart attack. My husband is not having a heart attack. By the time I arrive, minutes later, this fact has been established. The tests have all turned out perfectly. Carl sleeps off the Versed while I sit by his bed in the tiny cardiac observation room. While watching him, I think about a flight we were on years ago. We were leaving Russia, and when we were going through all the various lines in the airport in Moscow, we noticed that nearly everyone had a baby. There was no overlooking it. We struck up a conversation with an American couple ahead of us in line. They were going home to America with a beautiful little girl they had just adopted. We congratulated them and said that we were on that flight to Atlanta as well. They were radiant in their happiness, this couple and their Russian baby. The closer we got to the gate, the more babies we saw, tiny infants, just walking toddlers. When the announcement came that it was time to board our flight, everyone who had a child gathered up their strollers and diaper bags and got into line. One direct flight from Moscow to Atlanta, and everyone who had come to Russia from the States to adopt a baby was on it. We were a little nervous at first, more than 100 babies on a 12-hour flight. But as it turned out, they were all happy. Happy parents, happy babies. None of them were anywhere near tired of each other. The people we met in line sat right across the aisle from us, their sweet girl in their arms. How random it all was, who got which baby and where they would all go later on connecting flights. Once we were airborne, the parents began to walk up and down the aisles, talking to one another, bouncing their infants in their arms. There was almost no crying until several hours into the flight, when the woman across the aisle from us came back to her seat. She was crying. Her husband was asleep. Carl asked her what was wrong. She waved him off, but he persisted. Carl persists. A woman in the back told me there was something wrong with her, she said, looking at her baby. The woman said she wasn't holding her head up right, and I should take her to see a neurologist as soon as we got home. Give me that baby, Carl said. He told her he was a doctor, that he had delivered hundreds of babies. He held out his hands, and she passed the infant over. Carl studied the baby carefully. He looked in her eyes, sat her upright, let the baby grab his finger. He did whatever he could think of to appear as medical as possible. I've looked at all these babies on the plane, he said to the woman. This is the best one. She leaned over, touched her daughter's head. Do you think so? I'll give you $20,000 for this baby. The woman and I both looked at him. What? I'd love to have this baby, he said. We can wait in Atlanta. My accountant will wire the money. I don't want to sell her, the woman said. She had the look on her face that anyone would have if a stranger holding your baby had just offered to buy her. This is the best baby I've ever seen, Carl said. If you don't feel sure about her, you could get another one. I thought the woman would call for the flight attendant, but instead, I watched her grief break apart. Grief dissipating, evaporating, vanishing. No, she said, I don't want to sell her. Carl handed the baby back with some regret and then gave the woman his card, in case you change your mind. She thanked him and thanked him. He had offered to buy her child, and in doing so had restored her to joy, which served to underscore what I'm constantly learning. Carl has an understanding of humanity that eludes me. Was the baby really okay? I whispered to him later. He didn't look up from his book. There's nothing wrong with that baby. The woman just needed someone to remind her how valuable her daughter was, how lucky they were. I remember again how valuable he is, how lucky we are. Carl isn't having a heart attack. Byron didn't know what might have caused the pain. Indigestion, stress, it didn't matter. Carl is beside me. The meeting I'm missing doesn't matter, and Sparky is fine with his dog friends at the bookstore. For as many times as the horrible thing happens, 1,000 times a day the horrible thing passes us by. A meteor could be skating past Earth's atmosphere this very minute. We'll never know how close we came to annihilation, but today I saw it. Everything I had and stood to lose and did not lose. Thanks to this fleeting clarity, the glow from the fluorescent tubes on the ceiling of this small cardiac recovery room lights up the whole world. The end.